Right now, as you watch this video, a single decision made inside a windowless room in Washington, D.C. is being shaped not by generals, not by diplomats, and not by the president's own instincts, but by 21 miles of water and the 3 navies currently sitting inside it. Russian, Chinese, and Iranian warships have simultaneously deployed into the Strait of Hormuz in what officials are calling a routine exercise. Real ships, real missiles, real sailors who have now trained together for 7 consecutive years. And here is what makes this far more than a military story that will scroll off your feed by tomorrow morning. These 3 navies moved into position at the exact same moment the United States was sending 2 of its most powerful carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. converging eastward toward the same 21-mile bottleneck. Through that corridor flows roughly 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply. Not occasionally, not during peacetime surges. Every single day, without interruption, the global economy depends on tankers passing through water that, as of February 20th, 2026, has opposing military forces physically present at both ends simultaneously. If you think this is routine geopolitical noise, you have not been watching the pattern that has been building in that water since 2019. Because what is unfolding right now is not a coincidence, it is a progression. And it just crossed an invisible threshold that decision makers in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran are all calculating against in real time. So let us break down precisely what is happening, why both sides made their moves simultaneously, what each navy actually brings to this specific geography beyond what any press release will admit, and what the entire structure of this confrontation is actually signaling to the world. On February 17, 2026, a Russian corvette docked at Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary naval installation on the Strait of Hormuz. On that same day, Chinese and Iranian warships moved into the Gulf of Oman and the northern Indian Ocean, completing the trilateral formation that has now become a recurring fixture of this region's military calendar. This was the official launch of Maritime Security Belt 2026, a joint exercise Russia, China, and Iran have conducted every single year since 2019. The official framing is familiar to anyone who has followed this pattern: anti-piracy operations, search and rescue coordination, protection of international trade routes, standard diplomatic language, defensible, deniable. And in February 2026, almost entirely beside the point, calling this exercise routine means ignoring the complete strategic context surrounding it, and the context is everything. At the exact same moment these 3 navies assembled in the Gulf, the USS Gerald R, Ford was transiting the Strait of Gibraltar heading east. President Trump had publicly given Iran a deadline, 10 to 15 days to reach a nuclear agreement or face consequences he described simply as bad. Senior national security officials had been called into the White House Situation Room specifically to discuss options regarding Iran's nuclear program. The pressure being applied by Washington was visible, public, and deliberate. And yet, despite all of that, Russia, China, and Iran moved their ships into position anyway, together, on schedule. With visible confidence, that is not coincidence. That is a deliberate, calculated signal sent in steel rather than diplomatic language. And understanding exactly what that signal means requires going much deeper than the headlines. Here is what analysts who study this formation will tell you is actually happening, and it goes considerably deeper than what most mainstream coverage is currently focusing on. Russia, China, and Iran are not attempting to start a conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. They are doing something far more strategically sophisticated than that. They are establishing, in real time, with real assets physically in the water, that any potential U.S. military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure will not happen in a vacuum. If Washington moves, it will not simply be managing Iranian fast boats and shore-based missile systems in a contained regional operation. It will be operating in a contested space where Russian and Chinese naval units are physically present, and where a miscalculation carries a fundamentally different geopolitical weight than it would if Iran were standing alone. Analysts use the term escalation management through presence. What it means in practice, you raise the cost of action without pulling a single trigger. You do not need to threaten. You simply need to be there, visibly, with assets that planners in Washington are required by professional obligation to model for. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point, becomes a different strategic environment the moment a Type 055 Chinese destroyer and a Russian electronic warfare vessel are sitting inside it. The calculation changes, not because those ships guarantee an outcome, but because their presence changes what Washington has to be willing to risk. That is the entire architecture of this exercise, and it has been building, layer by layer, for 7 consecutive years. The Maritime Security Belt exercise has now run for 7 consecutive years. That number is not a footnote. It is the single most important data point in this entire story. 7 years of trilateral naval coordination means 7 years of shared communication protocols integrated procedures, and genuine tactical familiarity between three navies that had almost no institutional relationship before 2019. In 2023, the exercises incorporated nighttime operations and drone integration, a direct operational response to how modern naval conflict evolved after the start of the Ukraine war. In 2024, they introduced live fire components, marking the formal transition from symbolic exercises toward genuine operational readiness testing. By 2025, the three navies were running electronic warfare simulations, radar jamming, and electromagnetic disruption scenarios, what analysts describe as the invisible layer of 21st century naval conflict. By February 2026, what started as a diplomatic gesture has been transformed into an integrated military capability that planners in Washington, London, and Riyadh are required to genuinely model for. You do not build 7 years of shared naval systems unless you intend for them to mean something when the moment arrives. Now add one more layer that almost no major outlet is currently connecting to this week's exercise. In January 2026, just last month, Russia, China, Iran, the UAE, and South Africa conducted a separate joint naval exercise in the South Atlantic Ocean. It was called Will for Peace 2026. It was framed explicitly as the first BRICS naval operation, a deliberate milestone, not a minor footnote in a diplomatic calendar. Russia's presidential aide, Nikolai Patrushev, stated afterward that BRICS should now be given what he called a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension. Think carefully about what that phrase actually represents. BRICS began as an economic conversation. Trade routes, development banks, alternatives to the dollar system. Now it is running synchronized naval exercises across 2 separate oceans, the South Atlantic in January, the Strait of Hormuz in February, the same calendar month. The economic architecture and the military posture are being deliberately stitched together into a single unified strategic framework in real time. That is not improvisation. That is a design. And it has been unfolding quietly and in plain sight for the better part of 6 years. This is the Iron Triangle, and it is time to break down what each side of it actually brings to this specific geography. Beyond what any official statement will acknowledge or any press briefing will confirm, Iran's contribution to the Iron Triangle is the most widely misunderstood piece of this formation, and that is exactly where we need to start. Western media coverage focuses on Iran's IRGC fast boats, speedcraft swarming tankers, boarding container ships in the Gulf. That footage is real, but it captures only the most visible and least strategically significant layer of what Iran has actually constructed in this theater. Beneath that surface, literally, Iran operates submarines specifically designed for one environment: the shallow, acoustically complex coastal waters of the Strait of Hormuz itself. The Ghadir class and the more advanced Fateh class submarines are purpose-built to exploit the noise profiles and narrow depth characteristics of Gulf waters, environments where advanced U.S. sonar systems face their most significant operational limitations. According to U.S. Naval Institute analysis and open source defense assessments updated through 2025, Iran currently operates a fleet of 20-plus Ghadir-class mini-submarines, with confirmed deployments along predictable U.S. carrier approach routes reported this week. But Iran's most powerful weapon in this theater is not any submarine. It is something far cheaper, far more scalable, and far more effective at achieving the same strategic outcome without a single confirmed act of war. According to estimates updated in 2025 by U.S. defense analysts and published by the Congressional Research Service, Iran holds approximately 5,000 to 6,000 naval mines, a stockpile that has grown rather than contracted during years of international sanctions. Here is precisely why that number matters, more than any missile battery currently deployed in the region. You do not need to detonate a single mine to win the economic battle. The credible threat alone is sufficient to freeze global oil markets within hours. The moment verified intelligence emerges that Iran has begun loading mines onto fast boats, maritime insurers pull coverage. No coverage means no tanker captain transits the strait. No transit means no oil flow. 20 million barrels of daily global supply stops moving without Iran firing a weapon, without a formal declaration of war, and without handing Washington a clean legal trigger for a response. Iran's underground naval base, carved into a mountainside and confirmed in satellite imagery from 2024, holds fast missile boats below the reach of overhead surveillance. You cannot strike what you cannot locate. That is Iran's ultimate geographic advantage in this confrontation. Before we get to China's contribution, if you are watching this on Mr. Gilly TV, you already know this channel goes deeper than the headlines on every story that matters. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now. This content is produced for analytical and educational purposes only. The geopolitical assessments presented reflect publicly available information from verified defense and intelligence sources. This channel does not advocate for military action, conflict, or any specific political outcome. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources and form independent conclusions. Here's something almost no mainstream outlet is currently saying with clarity. China has deployed what the U.S. Navy officially classifies as a peer-level surface combatant into waters sitting directly adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. Not a patrol vessel, not a symbolic gesture of solidarity. A Type 0055 Renhai-class destroyer, 13,000 tons displacement, 112 vertical launch cells, dual-band radar systems, and as of late 2025, confirmed hypersonic anti-ship missile capability in the form of the YJ-21, a weapon the U.S. Navy has no confirmed operational defense against at its terminal approach speed. Hypersonic in this context means Mach 5 or faster at the point of impact, the final seconds before the missile reaches its target. The entire architecture of U.S. naval air defense was engineered around subsonic and supersonic threats, with intercept windows measured in minutes. A Mach 8 terminal approach compresses that window to seconds. China did not send the Type 055 alone. It came with a formation that includes a vessel that matters more strategically than the warships themselves, the Luoyang-class intelligence collection ship, a floating signals intelligence platform packed with sensors whose entire operational purpose is to track the movements of U.S. carrier strike groups and relay positional data in real time. Reporting from June 2025 during active Israel-Iran hostilities suggested that China was providing satellite-derived positional data on U.S. and Israeli strike movements to Iranian forces in near real time. That specific reporting has not been officially confirmed by Washington, and Beijing has categorically denied it. But if the reporting is accurate, China's satellite network was functioning as a live intelligence layer in a conflict involving U.S. assets. That same category of vessel is now present again. In the same waters, at the same moment, two U.S. carrier groups are converging. The pattern is visible even when the intent cannot be confirmed. Russia's contribution is the one that surprises most analysts when they look past the headlines. Russia's surface fleet in the specific region is limited. The war in Ukraine has extracted real operational costs, and Russia is not projecting significant blue water combat power into the Gulf in 2026. What Russia brings is something neither of the other two powers can fully replicate: battle-hardened electronic warfare systems developed and tested in an active conflict environment, combined with the diplomatic weight that transforms this formation from a regional exercise into something categorically different. When Russia is physically present in these waters, this stops being a China-Iran bilateral exercise by any definition used in international law or diplomatic convention. It becomes a trilateral deployment of 3 permanent UN Security Council members, 2 of them holding nuclear arsenals. You cannot call this a rogue state provocation. You cannot treat it as a regional problem requiring a regional fix. The framing changes completely, and with it, the range of responses available to Washington. That diplomatic multiplier effect is Russia's primary contribution to the Iron Triangle in February 2026, and it is worth more in this specific context than any additional warship. Iran's supreme leader said something on February 17th that received far less attention in Western media than it deserved, and the specific wording is worth examining carefully. Speaking publicly, Khamenei stated, "A warship is certainly a dangerous weapon, but more dangerous is the weapon capable of sinking it into the depths of the sea." He offered no further specification, no name, no technical detail, just a statement delivered with the flat confidence of someone describing a condition that already exists. On the same day, Iran officially closed portions of the Strait of Hormuz during live-fire drills. The Times of Israel reported analysts describing the closure as rare, perhaps unprecedented in the Strait's modern operating history. That framing matters. What Iran demonstrated on February 17th was not a signal about future capability. It was a live demonstration that the power to close this waterway is real, exercisable, and ready to be used. Tom Shughart, adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and a retired U.S. Navy submarine warfare officer, put the operational reality precisely in comments to the War Zone. Any planned strike on Iran would require planners to ensure that Russian and Chinese sensors do not give Tehran advanced warning of the strike package, and that foreign platforms are not physically in the way when the operation launches. That is not a hypothetical problem in a think tank paper. That is a checklist item sitting on real desks in the Pentagon right now. The reason it is a genuine operational checklist item comes directly back to what Iran has positioned in the water this week: 20-plus Ghadir-class mini-submarines confirmed by open-source reporting as of this month, deployed along the predictable approach routes any U.S. carrier strike group must use to access the Persian Gulf. The Ghadir is not impressive by conventional naval standards. It is small, it is slow, its operational range is significantly limited. But inside the Strait of Hormuz, those characteristics become strategically irrelevant. The usable shipping channels through the strait's narrowest navigable point measure only approximately 2 miles wide in each direction. Every vessel, military warship or commercial tanker, is compressed into those same predictable, unavoidable lanes. A small submarine operating close to the Iranian coastline in 2 miles of usable channel does not need to hunt its target. It simply needs to wait for the target to come to it. Iran's published doctrine does not require any single Gadir to succeed. The strategy, described in detail in a threat assessment published this week by the Naval War College Review, is a layered constraint campaign. Multiple dispersed mini-submarines combined with covert minefields positioned along predictable transit routes, transforming the strait and its approaches into what the assessment calls a potential denial zone. The carrier itself, a nuclear-powered vessel valued at over $13 billion, does not enter the shallowest waters. But its escorts, logistics ships, and the Chokepoint transit create windows of exposure. In warfare, even a small probability of a successful hit on a carrier carries outsized strategic weight. The target is not only steel and sailors, it is the political symbol of American naval primacy. Iran does not need to sink a carrier to win this phase of the confrontation. Iran needs only to make the probability of attempting it feel unacceptably high to the commanders making the call. That is sea denial doctrine. And it is precisely what 20-plus submarines positioned this week are designed to communicate in the clearest possible professional language. This week's exercise introduced something specific and new that deserves close examination. The IRGC Navy deployed what Iranian state media described as armed drones capable of engaging both air and sea targets, operating in significant numbers from Iran's 3 strategic islands in the Strait of Hormuz: Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, and Lesser Tumb. Iran has controlled those islands since 1971, and the UAE has disputed that control ever since. From those islands, since 1971, and the UAE has disputed that control ever since. From those islands, drone swarms do not need range. They are already positioned inside the operational kill zone. They launch, acquire targets, and can engage within minutes before a carrier's layered defensive systems have fully cycled through their response protocols. The U.S. Navy's defense architecture against drone swarms is layered and genuine. Phalanx close-in weapon systems, rolling airframe missiles, and directed energy weapons currently being tested on select surface combatants. But the financial mathematics of swarm warfare are deeply unfavorable to the defender. Each defensive intercept costs between $400,000 and $2 million, depending on the system used. A combat drone, manufactured in an Iranian factory, costs a fraction of that. You do not win a swarm engagement by shooting down every drone. You win by overwhelming the cost-exchange ratio until the defender either exhausts its interceptor inventory or accepts catastrophic damage to avoid bankruptcy. This is not a theoretical problem. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea from 2023 through 2025 ran this exact financial playbook against U.S. Navy destroyers operating in that theater, and the mathematics were deeply unfavorable. According to defense budget reporting from the Congressional Budget Office, USS Carney alone expended interceptor missiles worth more than $2 billion in a single week defending against Houthi, drone, and missile attacks during that campaign. Iran's version of the same strategy, operating from its own coastline and islands with the surveillance architecture now present in the strait, is the upgraded and geographically concentrated version of that same calculation. The U.S. military posture in the region right now is genuinely formidable, and that needs to be stated clearly. 12 surface combatants, 2 carrier strike groups, an estimated 600-plus Tomahawk cruise missiles across the deployed fleet. F-22 Raptors forward deployed to the region as of this week, 36 F-16s moving toward the Middle East from bases in Europe and the continental United States. F-35Cs embarked on both carriers. By almost every conventional measurement of raw military capability, the United States maintains overwhelming advantage in this theater. Serious analysts on every side of this debate acknowledge that reality without qualification. But the question that actually matters here is not whether the U.S. military can defeat Iran's armed forces. That question has always had the same answer, and everyone in every relevant capital knows what that answer is. The question that is actually being calculated right now, not in press conferences, not in public statements, but in the Situation Room, is whether the cost of doing so in ships, in lives, in political capital, in oil prices, and in the credibility of every allied relationship Washington holds, is proportionate to the objective. And that calculation changes categorically the moment you add 20-plus mini-submarines, drone swarms operating from 3 islands already inside the strait, a mine inventory of 5,000 to 6,000, and a Chinese intelligence vessel feeding real-time positional data to a country whose supreme leader just publicly stated that the weapon capable of sinking a warship is already in position. The Iron Triangle does not need to defeat the United States of America. It needs to make the price of action feel higher than the price of a deal. That has been the entire strategic logic of this trilateral formation, from its first exercise in 2019 to this precise moment in the water in February 2026. Here is the single number that ties every thread of this story together into one unavoidable figure: $120 to $130 per barrel. That is JP Morgan's published price estimate for global crude oil in the event of a Strait of Hormuz closure. Not a fringe scenario, not a think tank speculation, but an official forecast from the largest bank in the United States. As of January 2026, Brent crude was trading at approximately $64 per barrel. Goldman Sachs puts the current geopolitical risk premium baked into oil prices at roughly $4 per barrel. $4. Almost nothing. That gap between $64 now and $130 in a closure scenario is the complete financial dimension of everything you have been watching unfold in the water over the past 72 hours. Here is where the Iron Triangle strategy becomes visible, not in military terms, but in economic terms, because the two are inseparable in this specific geography. The number that almost nobody in mainstream Western coverage is discussing directly right now is 27%. That is the share of all seaborne crude oil and petroleum products that transited the Strait of Hormuz, according to EIA data published in early 2025. Not 20%. That figure represents the share of global total consumption. The share of maritime oil trade is higher. Over 1/4 of every barrel moved by ship anywhere on Earth passes through this single 21-mile corridor. Add to that 22% of global LNG trade, primarily Qatar's exports, flowing through the same passage, and you begin to see the true scale of what is structurally at stake in this confrontation. Now here is the piece that explains China's presence in this exercise as something fundamentally beyond military solidarity, and it is hiding in plain sight in the EIA's own shipping data. 84% of the crude oil and LNG moving through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea alone absorbed 69% of all Hormuz flows. The United States, by contrast, sourced only approximately 7% of its crude imports through Hormuz in 2024, a figure dramatically reduced by the domestic shale production expansion of the past decade. The country most economically threatened by a Strait of Hormuz disruption is not the United States. It is China, which imports approximately 25% of its total oil supply through this exact waterway. When the Type 055 destroyer positioned itself this week in waters adjacent to the strait, it was not purely a gesture of geopolitical solidarity with Tehran. It was Beijing protecting its own economy with its own naval assets. That reframes the entire confrontation in a fundamental way. The country with the most to lose economically from a strait disruption is also the country with the most capable naval hardware currently present in those waters. And it happens to be aligned with the country being threatened with military action by Washington. The Dallas Federal Reserve ran a formal scenario analysis on this exact question in 2025. Their finding: a full Strait of Hormuz closure drives WTI crude to $100 per barrel. At $100 oil, their model projects a cumulative 1.3 percentage point increase in annualized U.S. headline inflation within 6 months. Bloomberg Neff's January 2026 analysis places Brent crude at $91 per barrel by late 2026, even under a partial disruption scenario, without a full closure. And here is the detail that matters most for the United States, specifically in February 2026. WTI crude is currently sitting at approximately $60 per barrel, almost precisely at the break-even threshold for most U.S. shale oil producers. Below $60, shale production becomes economically unviable at scale. A Trump administration publicly committed to American energy dominance and domestic production. Expansion has a structural interest in keeping oil prices above that threshold, but not so elevated they produce the inflation that would undermine the broader economic agenda. That is an extremely narrow band to navigate, and the Iron Triangle's physical presence in the strait makes it structurally impossible to control that band without resolving the underlying geopolitical tension. The alternative pipeline routes around the strait exist on paper, but fall critically short of replacing the volume in practice. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline can carry approximately 5 million barrels per day, expandable to 7 million under full utilization. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline adds approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, combined bypass capacity, approximately 8 million barrels per day. The strait currently moves 20 million barrels. Iraq, Qatar, and Kuwait have no meaningful bypass infrastructure at all. Drawing down global strategic petroleum reserves, the U.S. holds roughly 600 million barrels. Europe another 400 million. Asian nations combined over 1 billion, buys approximately 2 months at current consumption rates under a full closure scenario. 2 months. After that, the global economy is running a supply deficit it cannot bridge through any existing alternative infrastructure. The Iron Triangle understands this energy arithmetic precisely. 7 years of exercises were the investment required to make that leverage real, credible, and impossible for Washington's decision makers to discount. Here is what I believe is the single most important thing to genuinely understand about the complete strategic picture of this confrontation. What is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not primarily a military story. It is fundamentally an economic and geographic story dressed in military hardware. Geography handed one side of this confrontation a structural advantage it did not need to build, fund, or engineer. It simply already existed. Iran did not construct the Strait of Hormuz. It did not engineer the geological accident that placed 20% of the world's daily oil supply on one side of its coastline. The strait simply exists, and Iran exists on one side of it by virtue of a historical boundary drawn long before the age of carrier strike groups. The decision by Russia and China to stand beside Iran within that geography has multiplied Tehran's leverage by an order of magnitude that no conventional military investment could have achieved on the same timeline or budget. The question that Washington is actually being forced to answer right now, not publicly, not in front of cameras, but in the room where decisions are made, is not, can we strike Iran? The answer to that question has always been yes, and it remains yes today. The question is, what happens to oil markets, to inflation, to every supply chain currently priced at $64 Brent crude, to the global economy, and to every allied relationship that Washington holds the morning after? And as of February 20th, 2026, 3 navies are physically in the water every hour, making sure that question feels heavier and that the cost of the answer feels higher than the cost of a negotiated outcome. Whether this confrontation ends with a nuclear agreement, a de-escalation of American pressure, a prolonged standoff that serves every party's short-term political interests, or something no analyst has yet fully modeled, the Strait of Hormuz will remain the axis around which it turns. Not because of the missiles pointed at carrier groups, not because of the submarines on the seabed or the drones sitting on 3 disputed islands, but because of 20 million barrels per day that have no other way out, and 3 countries that have spent 7 years positioning themselves to determine whether those barrels flow or stop. That is the final and most decisive piece of the Iron Triangle. Not warships, not submarines, not hypersonic missiles. 20 million barrels per day and the credible, rehearsed 7-year-old capability to control them. If this analysis changed how you understand what is currently unfolding in the Strait, drop a comment below. What do you think the next move is? A deal, an escalation, or a prolonged standoff that nobody in any of these capitals actually wins? And if you have made it this far, you already know that Mr. Gilly TV goes deeper than the headlines on every story that shapes the world you live in. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the bell. Because what comes next in this confrontation is moving fast, and the next piece of this story, the nuclear negotiation timeline, what Trump's actual deadline means in operational terms, and what a deal would actually have to contain to satisfy all 4 parties simultaneously. That analysis drops next. Do not miss it. Subscribe to Mr. Gilly TV. I will see you in the next one.